Wanderers have searched the highest mountain passes. They have delved deep into the earth in search for the ultimate must-read fantasy list. When they really didn't need it, they just needed to watch this video. There are so many top 10 lists for fantasy books, and quite often it's people's opinion or a group of people's opinion. This can be influenced by trends and recent releases, and the books are just doing really well at that moment in time. So I thought I would pull together the top 10 fantasy series that I see most recommended in all of my time in the fantasy community, here making videos in the Discords, on Instagram, watching hours of booktube videos, and just interacting with the community. These ones seem to be the most recommended and come up the most often. Therefore, they're kind of the must-reads of the genre. However, I'd be really interested in your opinion on this list and the 10 that I picked. Is there a series that you could swap out for one of these on this list that's just been recommended over and over and over to you from a lot of different people? Without further ado, let's talk some books. Let's start off with the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. You need to spend no longer than 60 seconds in the fantasy genre before you hear the name Brandon Sanderson. I was torn between putting the Stormlight Archive or Mistborn, but I do think the Stormlight Archive turns up on more people's recommendations to others. Despite the fact that most would say you need to read Mistborn first, the name Stormlight seems to come up more often. This is an ongoing series. There are currently 4 books out, and we're getting the 5th book at the end of 2024, and it's planned to be a 10-book series. However, it's in 2 arcs. So the first 5 books are an arc, and then you'll have a wee bit of a break, work on other books, and then come back and write the second 5 in the Stormlight Archive. So the fact that this is already one of the biggest series in all of fantasy, and it's only got 4 books out, is insane. That being said, there's enough pages for you to have about 8 books in this. Sanderson even said himself when he writes a Stormlight book, he does plan it out as 3 separate books. It's like writing a trilogy. Insanity. But the Stormlight Archive is Sanderson's main series that ties into his Cosmere, which is his connected universe that ties in all his books together. So if you read his other works, you might see familiar faces in the Stormlight Archive. This series certainly has scale. They're all well over 1,000 pages long, and they mainly revolve around 3 points of views. Kaladin, a slave who is put to work carrying these huge bridges with his team of bridgemen, Shalon, who is training to become a scholar, and Dalinar, who is an old grizzled warlord type character who has a pretty dark past. Well, they all kind of do. If you're looking for an epic fantasy series, you can't get any more epic than the Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive is one of my favorite series of all time, so very easy for me just to say, just go read it. It's really good. Next up, we have the Queen of Trauma herself, Robin Hobb. If you ask in the fantasy community, which is the author that will leave me devastated and emotionally damaged, most of them will come back and say Robin Hobb. She has sent many a reader to therapy. Her main series is The Realm of the Elderlings, which is a 16-book series that's broken up into several trilogies and a slightly longer series in the middle. And while you can read them a little bit out of order, it's highly recommended from most fans that you read them starting with the Farseer trilogy. The first book being Assassin's Apprentice. Robin Hobb is most well known for her character work. Equally, her writing and her prose style is meant to be beautiful. I have heard that some of the pacing can be a little slow throughout the series. However, people are obsessed with this series and say it's one of the best of all time, which after reading 16 of them, you'd hope that the ending would land. And I've heard nothing but amazing things about the ending itself. So if you're looking for some traumatic heartbreak, character-driven, beautifully written stories, long 16-book series, definitely check out Realm of the Elderlings. Next up, we have probably the second biggest fantasy series of all time. That is The Wheel of Time. This 14-book series with a prequel novel as well, so it's pretty much 15-book series, is a behemoth in the fantasy genre. So many authors take inspiration from this series and also another series that we're going to talk about later that you'll probably have heard of once or twice before. This is another series that has a huge scale. Most of the books are 700 to 1,000 pages long. What I personally love about this series is the feeling that the prose and the atmosphere creates. It feels so classic fantasy. because it is classic fantasy. But it's just so comforting and enjoyable the way it's written. This has a very classic fantasy setup. We have a farm boy who lives out in the middle of nowhere, getting whisked away on an adventure. We have an evil Dark Lord rising in the background. We have a large cast of characters. We visit lots of different cities and meet lots of different cultures and people. The world building is really, really interesting. They have a magic system that only works for females because the male side of the magic system has been tainted by this darkness. So whenever a male tries to access the male side of the magic system, they can go mad. So if you're looking for some classic fantasy that's iconic in the genre, Wheel of Time. And just a little side fact on the Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan did sadly pass away before he finished the series, so Brandon Sanderson actually picked up the series and wrote on from book 12 to 14. However, despite this, it is still said to be really, really good, the Brandon Sanderson novels, and I've heard nothing but amazing things about the final book. To me, reading a series of that size has to have a satisfying ending, and I'm pleased to say, from what I've heard, the Wheel of Time does. Despite being only 2 books in a trilogy, the Kingkiller Chronicles is the next one on this list. While we've been waiting for a very long time for the 3rd book, this is still one of the most recommended series in all of fantasy. And in my opinion, I think that's for good reason. The first thing that everybody talks about with the Kingkiller Chronicles is the prose style. Patrick Rothfuss writes beautifully. Every sentence and passage is so beautifully and purposefully crafted to evoke emotion from the reader. You could have the main character Kavoth just walking down a corridor. The way Patrick Rothfuss just writes, this uses a framing narrative. It has Kavoth in the future sitting down and talking about his life, and a pretty traumatic life that is. Rothfuss creates such a unique world that's so deep and detailed that we don't get in a lot of other fantasy series. The amount of mysteries and hidden lore that we get throughout this book that then connects to the main story is so purposefully crafted, and the level of foresight that Mr. Rothfuss must have had to write this trilogy is just insane, because the details and the small little connections and foreshadowing makes this the perfect series to reread over and over again. While I am a huge fan of this series, Jay over at Captured in Words is a bigger fan than I am of this series and does some amazing breakdown videos about all the different lore. Also made me realize how much of this series has gone completely over my head because it is so detailed. There's also a school trope setup in the first book. I know a lot of people love school trope setups, so if you're looking for something like that, beautifully written fantasy, definitely check out the Kingkiller Chronicles. I know a lot of people don't recommend this series because the 3rd book isn't out and we don't know if it ever will come out. However, I really believe that this series is so good that it would be a miss not to read it, even if it isn't completely finished. Next up, we have the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Sliding into the darker side of fantasy now, this is a grim dark fantasy series, which means it's a lot more grim and dark. I have yet to read the First Law trilogy, but one of the things I find most amusing is when people talk about it, they have no idea how to talk about the plot. You ask them what the book's about and they're like, they can give you atmosphere and the sort of tone of the book, but a lot of people struggle to describe the plot, specifically in this first book, The Blade itself. However, it's still named one of the best fantasy books of all time. Much like Robin Hood, but a lot darker, Joe Abercrombie is really known for his character work. And while people always talk about how dark this book is, they also always say it's very witty and quite funny in parts. It's so many people's favourite reads of all time. Particularly because after this trilogy, there is a 2nd trilogy that follows a lot of the next generation of this world, and it's also been getting an amazing name. So if you're looking for some grim, dark, snarky, fun, character-driven works, Joe Abercrombie, definitely the way to go. Next up, we have A Song of Ice and Fire, also commonly known as Game of Thrones, which is the name of the first book because of the TV show adaptation that really catapulted this series into the stratosphere of fantasy. However, even before then, it was absolutely huge. And much like the TV show, the books are known for being very dark, very political, lots of very tense discussions between characters, some amazing character work with people like Tyrion, one of my favorite characters. He's just great. And George R.R. Martin is really known for killing off main characters, so you know when you read the series that even your favourites aren't safe. And that does give this tenseness to reading books. You're like, he better not kill my favourite character off. That you can get in other series, but it's very much amplified with Game of Thrones because he is so murder happy to just kill off characters. I'm not sure I need to go on too long about A Song of Ice and Fire. It's huge. Okay, next up is a series that I see all the time. You see it absolutely everywhere, and there seems to be an influx recently of people reading it. And it sounds incredible, but I know pretty much nothing about it, and I don't understand the bits that I do know about it. I'm sure for that a lot of fans will already have guessed what series this is. The Malazan series. First book being Gardens of the Moon. The main series has 10 books, but aside from that there are a bunch of other books in the world as well. And this series is really known for its complexity. Where Sanderson is really known for his accessibility, Malazan is known for the opposite of that. There's no hand holding, it's very difficult to follow sometimes. There are entire podcasts that talk about the lore and the background just to make things make sense from the main books. And a lot of readers do read this in bigger groups so they can bounce ideas off each other and just discuss it. But it does really add to the community feel of the Malazan community. It does seem to have some very heart-wrenching moments in the series as well, so it's not all just confusion and not knowing what's going on. One thing the Malazan community really says, once you do start to get a handle on things and you're starting to understand things a bit better, that's really satisfying to start putting pieces together. I personally do plan to pick up this series next year because I know Broken Binding are doing a special edition set of all 10 books. But there are a ton of videos about the Malazan series and getting into it, so if it's something you want to check out, I highly recommend looking up some videos of just before you read it type videos that will be able to tell you a lot more about the series than I can. Okay, picture this, a giant turtle floating through space, and upon its back are some elephants. Those elephants are holding up the world, but the world is a disc rather than a globe. That is what the world looks like in Discworld by Terry Pratchett. And there are, according to Google, 41 Discworld novels. However, a lot of them are very short. And while they are all connected and they do kind of have arcs, the author did say that you can kind of start anywhere in Discworld. The wackiest and most original fantasy since Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And that's kind of how this feels tonally. It's very light and comedic and a lot of fun, but it does touch on some deeper themes as well. And it inverts and pokes fun at a lot about what you know about fantasy. So if you're looking for something that's a lot of fun but touches on deeper themes, has some really wacky characters and world building, Discworld is the series to check out. This next book I'm a little bit torn about putting on this list because equally it could also be this author's other series, but I'm going to say Malice, or the Faithful and the Fallen series. I love John Gwynn's writing style. It's very brutal and it fits his worlds so well. The way he describes fighting sequences and death scenes, it's just The Banished Lands has a violent past where armies of men and giants clashed shields in battle, the earth running dark with their heart's blood. Those who can still read the signs see a threat far greater than the ancient wars. Sorrow will darken the world as angels and demons make it their battlefield. Then there will be a war to end all wars. Very epic scale medieval fantasy, very brutal, pretty dark, and absolutely and hugely popular. And last, but certainly not least, probably the most recommended series in all of fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. Don't think there's much I need to say about The Lord of the Rings. If you're watching this video, you will already know the premise if you've not already seen the movies or even read the book itself. Tolkien really was the grandfather of modern fantasy. And while it doesn't necessarily have the same accessibility and modern sensibilities in the genre, is still a terrific read and really a must read. The must read in the fantasy genre. The level of detail that Tolkien put in this world and its lore and its past, all the different languages and maps, but also changing maps, the map from some of the early ages are different from the later age maps. He really did create an evolving world that even to this day we've not seen replicated. Without Tolkien, the fantasy genre would not be what it is today. He really created a lot of the inspirations and the tropes that we see in all of modern fantasy now. It's a must read. It is the must read. So that's it. That is my top 10 must reads in all of the fantasy genre. Do you agree with this list? Is there another series that you think deserves a spot on this list instead of one of these? I will say I was kind of on the fence with the Faithful and the Fallen and the Gentleman Bastard series, but I do think I've probably been recommended the Faithful and the Fallen a little bit more. But I'd be really interested to hear what you think. Are these the ultimate must reads of the genre, or am I missing something? But yes, thank you very much for watching. Outro.